herzlich willkommen.
A warm welcome to our panel on strategic partnerships. Lars Klingbeil mentioned it in the keynote speech. He talked about centers that the world is going to be organized around, and at the core, he said that in Europe, we need to become a soft power, forge new alliances, enter into partnership agreements, and offer open structures in order to be attractive, the most attractive center in this world. And Svenja Schulze just spoke about development policy as a prescient form of security policy. We also talked about the question of dependencies, how we have to reshape our autonomy. But now I'd like to start with you, Ms. Naidu. You represent a think tank in Geneva. Do you hear me? That represents the interests of the Global South within international organizations. In the speech by Mr. Klingbeil, there was a lot of talking about alliances with the Global South, partnerships, and so on. And Mr. Schulze also mentioned this repeatedly. What does this sound like to you? How can such a partnership be created? How can it be implemented? And just last week, you took part in the minister conference of the World Trade Organization. What was it like? Did you already feel that spirit of partnership?
Thank you so much. At the outset, let me just thank FES and the government of Germany for inviting the South Center to this very important dialogue. So the South Center is basically an intergovernmental organization. We were established by the South for the South. But very important to mention is that the South Center is and promotes North-South relations. And so, we take particular notice to what's happening geopolitically, but particularly, from a trade for development perspective, which is the issues that I cover. And I think if I had to be very blunt, one of the most fundamental challenges facing the Global South and facing this potential collaboration for honest and true partnerships would be that there is certainly a trust deficit. And this is a trust deficit that, it stems from a very long history, of course. But I think more recently it's between, this notion of the rhetoric versus the reality. So there's a number of international mandates, for example, in multilateral organizations, but you find that a lot of the power imbalances that exist between the North and the South are extremely prevalent still to this day. So a lot of the issues, for example, that are being championed by developed countries really take priority and center stage at the WTO. But this is not only limited to the WTO, but in other international organizations as well. I mean, there's also the perception that the UN, for example, is seen to be championing more of the global North issues. And so it's been a very long struggle in terms of trying to get a balance or a semblance of a balance into the negotiating agenda. But one of the things that I wanted to point out regarding, this notion of having true partnerships, which is a fundamental acknowledgement, I believe, for this dialogue today, and that would be, that true partnerships are made between equals with common interests. And, I've mentioned before that in some of the trade agreements, for example, we note that the North-South relations, as demonstrated, for example, by the economic partnership agreements, are not necessarily, on a level playing field. So I think, to leave this meeting would be important to point out that I guess we need a fundamental change in the way in which, we negotiate trade deals if true partnerships are indeed sought. And there's just one other thing that I wanted to point out. There's a lot of things that are happening in the name of sustainability. These items are coming up on the international agenda. But one of the challenges is that it's not really addressing sustainability. So if we talk about the WTO MC12 that just finished on Friday morning, an instrument on fisheries subsidies was negotiated. But if you look at the way in which the negotiation has been contextualized, it was under SDG 14.6, which talks about prohibiting subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. And one of the things is that in the text itself, there's already carve-outs that have been built in that would allow the big subsidizers to get off scot-free. So, you know, it's in the rules themselves where the mandates are not being addressed. And so this is a real problem, I think, for the sustainability agenda in the WTO, which is primarily, unfortunately, pushed by developed countries. And so this is one of the primary reasons, you know, why there's this lack of trust. And I think it's very, very fundamental that developing countries also have a voice, that they can sit at the table, and that they can have their issues also addressed. You know, for example, under special and differential treatment in the WTO, they've been pursuing certain rules that would promote their infant industry protection, for example. So a lot of the policy space that developed countries had before some of the WTO agreements were in place, and even pre-WTO, all of those rules now constrain the ability for most developing countries to build their capacities and develop. So I'd leave it there for now.
Okay, vielen Dank. Ich war gerade auf Englisch.
Thank you very much. I will switch to.
Nachfragen, dass es überhaupt.
I would like to follow up on that. I mean, that there were results was already a success at the ministerial. So this shows that multilateralism is still alive, or how would you see it when you look at the United Nations and Geneva and multilateralism? I mean, this morning we talked about how difficult the UN reform is. So what would be concrete steps that Germany, for example, could take together with countries of the global south, with developing countries, in order to reform the United Nations?
Thank you. So, I mean, indeed, I think one of the most positive signals coming out of the WTO MC12 was not really the balance in the outcomes, but that something was actually achieved. So, I mean, I would like to point out that perhaps multilateralism isn't really dead. There's just a serious legitimacy crisis. It's not really broken. We just really need to fix it. And I think a lot of the messages coming out of the WTO is that we could eventually come together amongst 164 members to agree to certain outcomes, and that's a very positive development. But if I had to focus particularly on what could be done in terms of partnerships, I think already, you know, the notion that the EU or that Germany needs to build and solidify its relationships with countries of the global south would be a very, very fundamental place to start. And, you know, this could be done through, I mean, I think it was mentioned earlier, through policy instruments, but a lot of them already exist. So perhaps, you know, I mean, if we're pursuing it from an economic perspective, we could look at how the bilateral negotiations are taking place. I know, for example, Germany plays a very important role in the African continental FTA negotiations, where they provide a lot of capacity building and technical assistance. So that's one opportunity, you know, where we could solidify the North-South relations. Another way would be to, you know, get the EU and get many developing countries to develop coalitions on issues of common interest. Yesterday, for example, I was, and that's the reason why I was here in Berlin, was a very, very important discussion on data infrastructures and digital sovereignty. And it looked at the context in the EU, in South Africa, and in India. And very, very interestingly, I could see so many complementarities just on the notion of digital sovereignty and the issue of data ownership, you know, trying to develop the digital development capacities, our ability to compete and engage in the digital economy. There were just so many important perspectives that came out of this platform that I truly believe there is an opportunity, I guess, for a third way, as you mentioned, a third way to look at, you know, you have the US model, you have the Chinese model, and then you have everybody else trying to get a piece of the pie. And perhaps, you know, I see a blossoming potential collaboration between the EU and many countries of the global south to pursue a digital development agenda.
Okay, vielen Dank. Da wir gerade über
Thank you very much. As we have just talked about trade, policy. Ms. Schulze, how can a just trade policy look like, which is beneficial to the developing countries, but also includes our German or European interests and allows us to compete in the geopolitical setting? What are the instruments that are available? I'm also thinking of the Supply Chain Act. Well, first of all, I think it's absolutely right to say that this needs to take place at a level playing field, although I don't like the word as such, but it needs to be done in partnership. And of course, we have to know and be transparent about our mutual interests. And I think that this is correct, that this was not always the case in the past, because whenever I travel around in the global south, I realize that there are more attractive offers than ours, because large infrastructure projects are not developing in cooperation with the EU, but with other partners. And this means that we have to become more attractive. And this is also one of the reasons why the G7, for example, once again emphasized that they want to set up an infrastructure initiative, that the G7 want to support the building up of a global health infrastructure. I think this is a step into the right direction. But this also means that we have to take things seriously. We all are talking about green hydrogen, for example. However, green hydrogen should not lead to a water shortage in the countries where there's already a water scarcity and a lot of sunshine. So we have to do it in a sustainable way. And this is actually being forgotten one or the other discussion. No, we are not allowed to import hydrogen in any form to Germany. We have to do this in a sustainable way with the sun-rich countries, and this should not lead to a new form of colonialism, but it should contribute to a development of those countries, the development of their own prospects, and to bring this into a discussion usually means that you are distorting or that you are hampering a discussion or people are opposing it, but this is actually necessary to bring this into the discussion. Well, now I would like to change the subject a little bit, even though it is connected, in particular when we think about Germany and the fact that Germany will always be dependent on raw material and energy imports, also when it comes to green energy. Yeah, Mr. Huotari, you wrote in an article recently that China might become the biggest challenge for the German foreign policy over the next years. So what did you read into the speech of Lars Klingbeil this morning? Are we up to the challenge, or did we miss something? Sorry, the speaker is not using a microphone. We cannot hear him.
Eigentlich sind Sie ja verkabelt, ne?
Oh, you're actually connected. You're wired to microphone? Okay, are you using the microphone? Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I think Lars Klingbeil has made one thing quite clear, which is a foreign policy vision in which China is more than just a partner, but maybe a competitor and a rival. And he has clearly defined that we have a vision or a social image and a social order and also a global ambition that is not in line with what we would strive for. And from that perspective, I think it's very important to take the next step and to ask, not only with regard to dependencies, but also with a view to foreign policy problems or shocks that we might be faced with, the slowing down of the economic growth in China. I mean, this will have an impact on all of us. We will see that in the near future. And also the biggest geopolitical crisis scenario, which is the conflict with Taiwan. So in all these questions, China is key. And we need a clear view on China, especially on how China is acting in the current conflict. For example, also the partnership that China is having with Moscow at the moment, and the security and foreign policy interests in Europe should be focused on that. We have to see that China is on a track which is a concern for us, and we, in the case of Russia, we have not taken these developments seriously, and now we have to ask ourselves, how closely can we be connected to China in the future, and how close can it be? So you said that we have to reduce our dependencies on China. Well, we have to have a differentiated look when it comes to the dependencies from China. And I mean, we already brought up the issue of critical raw materials, and of course, we need them for key technologies. And of course, this would bring us from one dependency to another. But when you take a look at the figures, we have a dependency of 90% or more when it comes to critical materials, but it goes far beyond that. It's also the dependency of markets, and we are well advised to diversify at the business level, at the economic level. So we should not place all our eggs into one basket, the Chinese basket. Well, when we want to implement the energy transition quickly and efficiently, we have to deal with China. Well, I do not say that we should have a black and white image. It just means that we have to reduce our dependencies, which cannot be done from one day to the other. And of course, in some areas, we will have to come to an agreement, and we also need to cooperate with China. But still, in those areas where we see a strategic impact, or in case of a crisis, we would be dependent on China, and this would maybe reduce our capacity to act, then of course we have to change that. Mr. Fratzscher, when critical goods and infrastructure will be produced and manufactured in Europe in the future, this is also what Lars Klingbeil said in a speech this morning, what's the kind of role that businesses will have in the future, and what should the state do in the future? Where should the state provide support? Well, it's a difficult question. I mean, first of all, a basic thought, we should not draw the wrong consequences from the conflict with Russia. Of course, I fully agree that we should redesign our dependency on China, but I would reword it and say we need a better symmetry. I think we will never be able to become independent, once again, because the global economy is too much interconnected. And especially we Germans have benefited from it more than any other over the past decades. So hundreds of millions of people in the global south were also getting out of poverty. Of course, there's much room for improvement still, but it's an illusion to believe that we could be independent once again. No, but we have to shape this dependency in ways so that we have a symmetric structure, that China is as dependent on us as we are on China. At the moment, I do agree, we have an asymmetric dependency. We are more dependent on China. And of course, there are also critical issues like digital infrastructure or the energy infrastructure, or the basic provision of services where we should provide these things on our own, which we should do on our own. And I think in Germany and Europe over the past 20 years we have been too naive. So, of course, this symmetry in our relations also brings me to standards. So China is not the fact that China is investing in Europe and in companies is something good, but we have an asymmetry. So in the public procurement, or when it comes to public tenders, we have to make sure that we see more symmetry. I mean, we do not see the same situation when German companies or European companies would like to invest in China. So what the Americans say is that there's certain infrastructure where we do not want to allow any foreign investment is right from my perspective. We were too naive in the past in Europe. We have weakened ourselves. But maybe one other aspect, multilateralism versus bilateralism. I mean, we increasingly see this competition between the US and China. And for us Europeans, the question is, do we want to have a bipolar or a tripolar world? I mean, this is not meant to disrespect the global south, but in particular in the important markets, the economic competition is very much divided into the Chinese system and the American system. And for us in Europe, the question is, do we want to make our European voice heard? So we also have to speak with one voice in Europe in order to make ourselves heard. And what I see in the discussion, in particular when it comes to the Russian war, is we have to win back more national sovereignty. But this is an illusion. From a German perspective, we will only be sovereign if we have a stronger European voice. So this is why I would like to see more agreement at the European level, not only in terms of the foreign policy or the Supply Chain Act. I mean, this is something that we started in Germany. Thank you also to the Federal Ministry for Development Cooperation, and this is what we like to foster at the European level as well. So this is actually the important starting point. Well, you mentioned the Supply Chain Act, but I would like to come back to the question which was discussed in the morning. For example, we have to have our own chip production, semiconductor production, which belongs to the important infrastructure, and this might not be efficient from an economic point of view. So the states would have to subsidize it. So is this going to be the price for freedom? Well, I would not contradict that, but realistically speaking, for us Europeans, I mean, we have lost out in certain areas. Also when it comes to critical technological platforms. And when it comes to biotechnology, the pharmaceutical sector, where we have concrete examples that we've seen throughout the pandemic, we are highly competitive in Europe. So we really have to focus on our competitive strengths in the future. We should not try to do everything on our own. I mean, you talked about the most important infrastructure, and I don't think that platform economies actually, that we can catch up in the field of this platform economy. But I think we need to develop a good balance between basic research, good market conditions, private investments. And very often you hear, well, we have too much state in Europe, but I would contradict that. I mean, if you look at the United States, much of the innovation, and also in Japan, for example, much of the innovation that is created there, also in the field of security, where lots of investment take place and many private companies invest, but also the state. So I think we need a European perspective. We should not think only in terms of Germany or based on the German perspective. We need to think about that from a European perspective. And in the digital field, we have scale, effects of scale. Or the winner takes it all effects. So in order to be competitive as a company, you need a large market. And the problem that we see right now in Europe is that we have 27 individual markets, and we do not have a single market when it comes to services, or we do not have a European banking market, so a banking union or a capital union. This is an area where we need to make more progress. We have to create the conditions so that we can have European champions and no longer only national champions. So in the past, ministers said we have to create national champions, but I think this is an illusion now. We will either have European champions or we will have no champions at all. Thank you very much. I would like to ask a question to Svenja Schulze, and then I would like to ask open up the discussion for the audience from the live stream. So in your speech earlier, you also mentioned China as a very important actor, an actor that offers alternatives to the global south. So how should we deal with it? Well, first of all, of course, China is committed, which isn't bad. So there's a certain degree of Western arrogance that we say, well, we are always better, everything we do is better and the others are stupid. So we have to stop that. So what is China doing? They're very strategic. They have created an Asian investment bank, that they also created a new development bank, and they explicitly offer alternatives to what we have built up together with the World Bank and the whole system of the United Nations. And this is something we have to deal with. And I think the best way to do that is to create better alternatives. We should not try to copy the Belt and Road Initiative. We should try to make a better offer than the Belt and Road Initiative. We should be self-confident, like with Global Gateway. We should be self-confident and make a European offer with a different set of values, with the clear statement that we do not want to create a dependency for you for the next 60 years, because the question of resilience and independence is also a question that arises on the African continent. But we offer you our set of values with democracy, with freedoms, with equity, with a feminist policy, in order to advertise our system and also to make clear what our rules are. For example, the Supply Chain Act. This really has an impact because this lets our work follow to where our words are. So we will not buy any products that were created with child labor. So this is a certain kind of coherence from our side. And of course, we can still improve in this regard. And what's been mentioned at the beginning, I can fully second. We have to win back trust. In the developing countries, we do have to win back trust. Trust that what we say is also what we do. What they experience right now is something different. Good. Thank you very much. Johanna Tompert, could you tell us something about the questions from the audience out there? Thank you very much. I would like to bring up one question. And first of all, I'd like to ask the audience here and out there, you can always use our hashtags on Twitter in order to raise questions. Well, now to the first question. Partnership at a level playing field and a socially just transformation. They do need investment. So why is the one-on-one distribution of the defense budget and the topics of development, cooperation, humanitarian aid, and civil crisis prevention, why don't we see this connection here? Well, this is something that we have laid out in coalition agreement. Of course, we want to invest as much into the diplomacy and development policy as in the military segment. We are not yet there. This is still a task that is lying ahead of us, but this is something that the SPD is actually trying to make progress on. It's, as I said, part of our coalition agreement, but we have not yet fulfilled it. This is still some homework we have to do. So no more questions at the moment. So I would like to come back to the question that's been discussed in the morning and that you already touched upon, Svenja. In order to put it into concrete terms, even in a decarbonized world, Germany will also be dependent on energy imports and will have to create different supply relations with countries of the global south. How can this partnership or relationship be put on a level playing field in terms of the energy partnerships? And then back to Svenja, should we preferably focus on democratic states under the rule of law, because this is possible when it comes to new energies? So when it comes to hydrogen, we are not dependent on specific countries, but there are many countries who could produce it.
So I think one of the biggest challenges coming out of the so-called sustainability agenda, but also, that Europe is leading on renewables and, in terms of the policy development. One of the challenges we're seeing both afflicting the global south, but also kind of finding its way into the WTO has been the carbon border adjustment measures. And, there's a big question mark about whether this is actually WTO compatible. But we're also at the South Center beginning to assess the impacts that this is going to have on developing countries. And we are particularly concerned, because, it brings back this notion of strengthening your domestic supply chains or your regional supply chains. But the challenge is that even in the African continent, as Minister has mentioned, African countries keep saying exactly the same thing, that they are looking to build resilient supply chains and regional supply chains through the AfCFTA agreement. So one of the, immediate challenges would be if we could look at addressing climate change and sustainability issues without having it, without punitive measures. Because at the moment, we're seeing a lot of countries who are going to be directly impacted by a lot of the legislation coming out of the EU. The OECD has done studies. UNCTAD has estimated that actually with the CBAM, it would only contribute to a 0.1% reduction in global emissions. And that overall, it will result in a loss of real income in developing countries up to 5.9 billion. So this is, a bit of a policy challenge. And I think a multilateral solution will be needed, but there's big questions about, whether the WTO would be the right forum for this to take place. But I think bilaterally and, amongst these regional agreements, these conversations can already take place. And in fact, they are. It's just that, many African countries are still far behind and they have a lot of catching up to do. And so I think in the development of these rules and in the development of these policies, there needs to be adequate time and space to give these countries, the opportunity not only to catch up, but to eventually become competitive.
Ich würde gerne noch mal einmal darauf reagieren.
I'd like to react to what you've just said. I think nobody is a real fan of the CBAMs because it's also a sign of powerlessness. Actually, we do not know how we deal with these different speeds. We are able of creating green steel, but not in conformity with the prices on the world market. So what do? Do we advance the technology? Do we start producing, but then the steel will not be bought?
Die Klimafragen immer weiter verzögern.
And we will again delay urgent climate matters. So I think we need responses to that problem. And I think one of the answers that has been developed is within the G7 is the climate partnerships. For example, with South Africa, we have launched the first climate partnership. It's not easy. It's a difficult issue, but we help South Africa to exit from carbon. But we won't stop there because lots of jobs are going to be lost. We need to create perspectives for people who so far have been working in coal, miners, everyone related to the coal industry. And so we need to choose alternatives. And yeah, that should be our goal, thinking these two things together, helping with decarbonization, but at the same time creating jobs. This would be a good path because that means we can balance these different speeds and we have to accelerate. Everything we're doing, climate change is advancing. It doesn't matter what problems we have. If we do not accelerate our measures, it's going to be extremely expensive for all of us and we're going to destroy livelihoods at a tremendous speed. So acceleration, investing faster, this is the big challenge of the day. And I think this discussion around CBAMs, it has already put a lot of things into motion, us talking about advancing these climate partnerships. But now let me get to the question that you asked. Do we only work with democracies? No, that's not enough. 70% of people on this planet live in autocracies. And if we just say that's it, then that doesn't work for me as a social democrat. I don't want that. I don't want to leave these people behind. I want to support countries in the democratic path. I am deeply convinced that democracy is the best form of government that will result in more sustainable solutions. But that means we have to be very confident and fight for our set of values. We shouldn't hide them. And that means I will want to work with authoritarian countries, but move incrementally and make sure that we can support them in their democratic process, strengthen civil society, move things forwards. I know it's a very tedious process, and this is what makes development policy so tricky. If you just evaluate and assess every 3 months, then it's horrific. It only gets interesting after 30 years. But we need this long-term thinking. And who will do it if not us social democrats? And this is why I have to say, no, we do not only work with democracy, because that means we'll only end up working with Europeans. We want the world to change. This is our ambition. And we want more people to be able to live in democracies.
Herr Huotari, Frau Naidu hat jetzt...
Mr. Huotari, Mrs. Naidu and also Mrs. Schulze mentioned a couple of times how important it is to discuss and solve these questions in multilateral institutions. What's the role of China in this multilateral context? How should we deal with China in multilateral institutions? How should we involve it? Well, first of all, China is a power center that we have underestimated within multilateral institutions for a long time. WTO, UN trading system, and so on, but also in technical organizations. China has approached these institutions, trained personnel, made use of these institutions, and we have underestimated China. And we have always perceived these institutions as positive and as interesting at a place for a level playing field. And I agree with the minister. Yes, there are other structures as well, where there's more a focus on China. For example, the BRICS Club, G7, and there are also some attempts in development policy at pushing for national interests. So yes, we have recognized China as a global power center. They're very apt at forging alliances and partnerships all around the world. And as the minister says, we have to create better alternatives and make the better offer, where other countries are maybe under pressure to choose between a US-centered world and a China-centered world. We have to make sure that at least this choice is there to be made and that it's not automatic. Thank you. Mr. Fratzscher, we have discussed about globalization, how to rethink it. You said it yourself, and The Economist newspaper also had a headline saying reinventing globalization. So it's a very hot issue. What is the impact of the pandemic, of the war on the economy, the structure of supply chains, for example? So if you say rethinking globalization, how can we rethink it in a more social way, not necessarily with regards to Germany? This also has an impact for sure, but at the global level. Well, we have to be more intelligent. I think you've already mentioned it. It's about resilience. That is to say, have several pillars to rely on and to prepare globalization better for crises and shocks. There's an increasing number, and it's also very cost-intensive. There's this increasing amount of crises, and so far it's been geared toward a positive trend, just-in-time globalization. You have the right product of a certain company, the right time, the right place. But now we understand that we need a globalization that thinks ahead. How can we cope with crises? It doesn't even have to be global crises. It can also be in the weakest, most vulnerable countries. How can we shape these moments to ensure that globalization will continue working, that supply chains will still be sufficient, and it will not result in some bottlenecks or inflation, price explosion, and so on. With the Russian conflict, we look at ourselves in Germany, but we don't understand that those who are actually suffering live in the global south. I'm afraid we will witness dramatic situations in the course of the next year with regards to famines and food security. But it also means we shouldn't just adopt a very economic perspective. Is it good for economic growth if we conclude a trade agreement, or reshaping trade barriers? My colleague, Daniel Roderick, talked about hyperglobalization. 25 years, we've had a hyperglobalization where it was all about one thing, economic performance, and maximizing that via trade agreements. I think we've created too many losers in this process, and that applies to the global south, but also for richer economies. If you look at Donald Trump, what brought him to power? It's very multifaceted. But I think the issue is also that due to globalization, jobs were lost. People that are not very qualified workers, they've lost their jobs, and we have to rethink this. In the global south and also in the more wealthy nations, we need to make globalization more social. I'm very happy you have this badge with the SDGs. Yes, this is what we need to gear globalization towards. We have to make sure we anchor the SDGs in globalization. This is the actual issues we need to discuss. We need other benchmarks for shaping globalization, not in this very narrow frame. How do we create economic value and growth and financial added value? We need another perspective.
Danke. Ich sehe, dass wir noch eine Frage haben.
Thank you. I was told we have another question. Thanks a lot. One more question. How should democratic feminist values be exported towards authoritarian systems if they would rather be dependent on economic relationships with China instead of the West? How do we practically collaborate with authoritarian regimes?
Also man kann eine feministische Außenpolitik machen.
Well, we can engage in feminist foreign policy because it means addressing the root causes of inequality. We can apply that to agriculture. It's often women who ensure food in developing countries. It's their responsibility. It's them who have the know-how. If women do not have access to land, they cannot grow. If they cannot grow, this will trigger a food crisis. So rights for women, respect for women, it's so important for any society, and it can be clearly measured. So yes, this can be a point of reference for development aid. We can say, yes, we will help you with agriculture, make you independent, but a condition is that women will have access to the land, because this is one of our core values, and this is a condition for our development aid. And I think we do that in many other areas. For democracy, yes, of course, participation, transparency, of course, these are conditions. We have to be able, our members of parliament, they're here also. We have to be able to tell them what we're doing with the money. So I think we should do that also for equal opportunities. That's not that hard, actually. Even in, tougher context. In Rwanda, no democracy, really, the history of genocide, but they do a lot for women on equal opportunities, and they realize, well, we're more than successful than others. And reinforcing these trends and taking this seriously and really grappling the root causes of inequality and problems. Societies that involve women, where women have the same rights, representation, and respect, they are more stable. And we are against fragility, against fragmentation. We want societies to be stable, and it's science. It's not just some form of moral attitude. It's scientifically proven that these societies there will be less fragile. So why would we omit this part of science? We shouldn't be ashamed of that. That we have all this insight. Of course, they should be an integral part of development policy, and as long as these questions are still being asked, we're not there yet.
Sehr gut, vielen Dank. Ich glaube, wir haben
Thanks so much again. I think we're left with very little time. So I'd like to get back to the supply chain law, and I'd like to hear your perspective, Mrs. Naidu. Do you believe that the supply chain law will create better jobs, more environmental and social protection in the countries of the global south? Will there be a more just, a more social globalization? Is that possible?
That's a tough one. But I think, and has been mentioned by my fellow panelists, that the pandemic has illustrated, just how inefficient some of the structural systems are that we've become accustomed to and that our economies are based on. But I think, with the weaknesses in the current supply chains, it all comes down to the lack of manufacturing capacity. If we look at primarily African countries and many other countries in the global south. And I think that, it's hindered their ability to access, for example, essential goods and food products during the lockdown. And to look at supply chain management, particularly, in the way in which, due diligence and kind of the direction that the EU is going forward with, I think it would really depend on how it's done in terms of its design, but also in terms of its implementation. As I mentioned before, I think a lot of developing countries are struggling with this notion of being penalized or, with punitive measures. But I think a better and a more positive approach would be to incentivize countries, to comply with certain practices, with supply chain systems and proper management and business practices, both in terms of human rights, in terms of labor standards, and general economic efficiency. And so it's difficult to just, pin it on something specific, but just to say that I think we should pay particular attention to the design and the implementation. And maybe just to say that, investment in this, in these economies to be able to subscribe to these sets of principles and rules will also be very important to see, in terms of whether they can comply and help where they can't. And I see, that's where the EU and Europe has been very, very helpful in terms of, the capacity building and the training and the technology transfer in developing some of these systems that we're seeing being implemented across the regions.
Gut, vielen Dank. Also wir haben gehört, das europäische Lieferkettengesetz kann wirken.
Thanks so much. So we heard that the supply chain law can be efficient, but it needs accompanying and flanking measures. And I think this is what you're actually trying to do already. So we've reached the end of our panel. Thanks so much for this very interesting discussion and for the questions that were asked. And I'll give the floor back to Johanna. Thank you very much.